Let me read to you a passage from the 18th chapter of St. Luke's Gospel, verses 9 to 14. It's the Gospel for Saturday of the third week of Lent. St. Luke writes, "To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself, 'God, I thank you that I am not like other men, robbers, evildoers and adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get.' But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, 'O God, have mercy on me, a sinner.' I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." That's from the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 18, verses 9 to 14. What does it suggest to us? Well, it tells us about authentic religion. You know, there are some fundamental human activities which all men and women find themselves engaged in. For instance, man must work in order to eat and to pursue his interests. Of course, he finds himself reflecting on things and making choices, some of which are momentous and have far-reaching consequences, and so the list could go on. Man also finds himself being religious, or tending to be religious, or taking to religion when it is presented to him as he grows. He is drawn into the religious life of his family and his community. As a result of his power of reflection and choice, he may abandon the religion of his upbringing and forego religion or adopt another. I think we could say that, looking at the matter anthropologically and sociologically, religion is one of the most common of human activities. So pervasive is it in traditional societies that, as has often been observed when setting man in the context of other living and conscious beings, man could be described as a religious being. Yes, of course, he works in order to eat and do other things, and of course he reflects and he chooses, but equally notable is the abundant manifestations of his religious life. But what is the essential activity of religion? What is it to be religious, authentically religious, and indeed profoundly religious? Of course, all understand that the religious person is the one who acknowledges God as the living master of his life, however God may be conceived and imagined. A person who through ignorance or neglect or deliberate choice did not recognize God in this way would never be described as religious, except in some analogous sense. That having been granted, could we make this more explicit and identify an inner attitude in forming one's recognition of God which marks the authentically religious person? Or putting it slightly differently, is there something the religious person, the one who recognizes God as master, should especially attempt to develop in his attitude towards God? In our Lord's day, as in every day, there were persons who were professionally religious and who led the people in their religion, but many of them were not especially religious at all. It is very fortunate that our Lord's teaching was commonly given in images rather than in, as with Aristotle, abstract discourse. Our Lord's teaching was meant for the world, including all the Aristotles, and so he spoke in the pictorial language of mankind. In our Gospel today that I read earlier from Luke chapter 18, verses 9 to 14, our Lord tells his well-known parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. And he turns firstly to the Pharisee. The Pharisee was the religious person in the view of society. Our Lord did not discount the role of the scribes and the Pharisees, and on one occasion he directed that his hearers do what they say, but avoid their example. They occupied the chair of Moses, he said. They were legitimate religious teachers, and they sustained to a greater or lesser extent the religious life of the nation. So, in his parable our Lord describes the Pharisee, and he is devastating in his description of the inner character of their religion. The prayer of the Pharisee was thus. He describes it in his parable. God, I thank you that I am not like other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get. Essentially, he exalted himself. The properly religious person exalts God, but the Pharisee in the parable exalted himself before God and before others. So there we have from the lips of our Lord himself, one thing that the religious person absolutely must not do. He must avoid self-exaltation like the plague. This self-exaltation can even be very secret, seen by God himself. By contrast, the tax collector stood far back, perhaps in the shadows of the temple, where he would scarcely be seen. He had nothing to show before the gaze of men, but most especially he had nothing to show before the gaze of God, and he knew it. As we read, he would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Now, Cardinal John Henry Newman, a leading religious mind of the 19th century, claimed that this prayer expressed the essence of authentic religion. The plain and manifest fact is that we are sinners, and he, Newman, maintained that even natural fallen man knows or should know this. We are sinners, and our most authentic act in religion is to acknowledge our sinfulness before God and to ask his forgiveness. Our Lord sums up the effect of each prayer and states that the Pharisee was left separated from God and still in sin, whereas the sinful tax collector, as a result of his prayer, was left reconciled with God. I tell you that this man, our Lord concludes, rather than the other, went home justified before God. What we must do, whether we are called to occupy a lowly and hidden place in the world or a prominent place that draws the esteem of others, is to be like the tax collector in our inner religion. Our heart must be steeped in humility and contrition before God. This is what it means to be authentically religious. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, our Lord says, and he who humbles himself will be exalted.